The St. Patrick's Day Dogman.
Welcome to Scary Stories, the channel that tells you scary stories.
The St. Patrick's Day Dogman is told to Peter Bernard, read by PQ Ribber. When I was in my early 20s, I got married to a legend tripper. This young woman knew about as much about weird world history as she did about hiking and camping, so we both developed careers that allowed us to work from the road, and off we went on one adventure after another. Little did we know that our light-hearted curiosity would lead to a St. Patrick's Day encounter with an infamous Dogman werewolf from Irish history, an encounter that we almost didn't survive. Here's what happened. My wife, let's call her Gwen, decided that since we were in England, long story, we should check out Wales. In particular, she was interested in the legend of Bad King Vereticus. She said her grandmother was Welsh and had told her when she was a kid that King Vereticus had been transformed into a werewolf by St. Patrick as punishment for being a bad dude of one sort or another. Gwen made plans for us to take a tour of Gwydir Castle, then venture south from there to an area in Gwydir Forest Park where we would camp out on the night of St. Patrick's Day and scout around for the Werewolf King. Yes, I know, I've got a weird wife, and no, you can't borrow her. So the forest park is hardly a forest park at all by American standards. I find it hard to believe that the large black dogs and black cats that people report in the forests of England could possibly exist here. There's not enough land, and it's also close to civilization. People say Bigfoot lives there in England. Where is there space for such a creature? What does he eat? My wife and I had looked into cryptid reports from England in depth. And I'll be honest, we were just camping there for fun. Neither of us expected to see King Vereticus, the Werewolf King, because we knew that it was just a fable, and we knew werewolves don't exist. So that's why, when the full moon cast the silhouette of the Dogman on the side of our tent that night, we were almost as shocked as when we heard the creature howl. Gwen insisted it had to be a joke, some kids playing a prank on us. I asked her if she was so sure. Why was she whispering? Firearms are not allowed in England, so I knew that if this were a real creature, we were in bad shape. I made a mental note that if we survived this, we would only camp in areas where I could properly protect myself. There was nothing we could do except quietly put our boots on and get ready to bolt out of there the first time it seemed safe. It felt like we were sitting there for hours, but it was probably just a few minutes. We hadn't heard whoever it was walking or howling for a while, so we both agreed that it was time to make a run for the car park and get out of there. My wife had decided this was a lunatic celebrating King Vereticus's memory by acting like a jerkass. She warned me that this guy might be dangerous. He might really think he's a monster. I thanked her for the warning. So we agreed on the path we would take, braking right immediately upon leaving the tent, running down the dirt path to the open field. From then on, we should be safe, unless whoever it was really wanted to attack us out in the open. After all, if nobody was around, then out in the open would be as private a place to victimize us as any other. Plus, we'd have to pace ourselves. It took 15 or 20 minutes to reach this spot, and we were not going to be able to do that all in one sprint. Bam! We exited the tent like a trained SWAT team, and bam, we weren't 50 or 60 feet from the tent when we saw it, standing there, directly in the middle of the path, in front of us, blocking our way. It was not a kid. Gwen started crying to my side as she realized that. It was an immense monster, but it was not a Bigfoot or Sasquatch kind of a monster. No, it was a monster like a werewolf. It was bad King Vereticus, and he looked hungry. This thing had to be 12 feet tall. It was ridiculous. When it screamed, we just fell back on our butts like something from a slapstick comedy. This was not how I wanted to go. I wanted a serious, dramatic, sad exit. I didn't want to be the butt of a Dogman joke. And then, nothing. As in, the Dogman disappeared. It didn't blink out. It sort of disintegrated into the air. Or a good word might be to say it looked like it was dissolved into the air itself. Was it really gone? Had it just become invisible? We didn't stick around to find out. The only thing I know for sure is that, unless this was some Penn and Teller level magician doing an act in the middle of the forest, we weren't being pranked. Occam's razor would point to this being an encounter with some sort of real, or at least supernatural entity. It seemed to be physically there, then it dissolved into the air like powdered sugar in water. We both are still convinced to this day that what we saw had to do with King Vereticus and St. Patrick turning him into an enchanted wolf. My advice to you, if you're looking to camp in Gwydir Castle, would be this. Don't camp there on St. Patrick's Day. Or if you do, bring some extra food for the resident Dogman.
Do you have a scary story you want us to read on the show? Just call our voicemail hotline, 804-LIST-SCARY. That's 804-537-2279. And now for something completely scary.
St. Patrick's Day, Leprechauns, and Dogman, as told to Peter Bernard, read by P.Q. Ribber. I recently learned from my grandson that Rheingold beer is back in business and popular among the kids in his hipster Brooklyn neighborhood. I started to tell him a story about a St. Patrick's Day from long ago before Rheingold was hip, when it was brewed in Bushwick, Brooklyn. My grandson rolled his eyes and pretended to be getting a phone call so that he didn't hear my story, the little twerp. If only he'd listened just one sentence more, he'd have found out that this isn't just any old man's story about beer and St. Patrick's Day. No, this is a story about beer, St. Patrick's Day, and Dogman. Sure, you'll be asking me what Dogman has to do with St. Patrick's Day, and you'll be wondering if perhaps I might have meant leprechauns instead of the Dogman. But don't you worry, this story has some leprechauns in it too, at least according to my buddy Seamus. Let me start at the beginning. Okay, it was 1969, because the Mets had just, no, wait a minute. The Mets had just won the World Series, and this was March. So it must have been March of 1970. My boss and some more prestigious co-workers were planning a big bash for St. Patrick's Day up in the northern part of New York State. I'd never been up there before, as I'd heard it was all Yankee fans living in those parts, and it probably wouldn't be safe for someone like me to visit. It's not so much like this anymore. But in those days, we former Brooklyn Dodgers fans felt an obligation to root for the Mets as the inheritor of the mantle of the underdog team in New York City. They were marketed as being the team for the regular working man, and the beer that sponsored the Mets was the locally brewed Rheingold beer. My beer, in those days, truly was Rheingold beer. So much so that I got a job at their plant in Bushwick and had been working there for 10 years. I was pretty friendly with some of the higher-ups since I'd been there so long. One of them is the guy who donated his home for the party, a really upscale mansion designed for entertaining. My boss told me that me and Seamus could get in if we drove the beer truck there from Brooklyn. The party was up near Buffalo, so that's a 7-hour drive each way if the traffic gods are merciful. We certainly would be earning our invitations. Okay, so this was 1970. We thought of ourselves as very sophisticated at the time, but looking back on it, there are some ways in which we were kind of primitive. For one thing, we were only beginning to realize how dumb it was to drive a motor vehicle while intoxicated. Actually, I'm not going to blame the times, and I definitely don't want anyone to think that's the way my coworkers would act. But Seamus and I were idiots. We were drinking from the truck on the trip up, and our reasoning was that we only drank while the other guy drove. Since we traded places every 90 minutes or so, this brilliant plan meant that no matter who drove, they would always be at least a little drunk. I forget how many hours into the drive it was, but apparently I had passed out in the passenger seat. Seamus was shaking me and telling me I had to drive. I really didn't want to get up, and I tried to stay in my dream, but it evaporated, and soon I couldn't even remember what it was about. I looked out the window, and I saw we were parked by a road sign for Burma Shave, or was it Tropicana orange juice? It was an advertising sign, maybe some kind of cola, I forget. I had to get out of the cab to walk around and get in the driver's side, and when the cooler night air hit me, I realized nature was calling and walked directly over to a patch of trees for a little privacy. Wait, colder? Night air? How could it be night? We left at 9 a.m. and this was a 7-hour drive. I wanted to run back and start interrogating Seamus, but I was sort of committed to the whole nature's call thing, so I had to finish that first before going back to the truck. As I walked toward the trees, I got a weird sense that I was being watched. I didn't hear anything strange and I didn't see anything moving, yet I still felt like I was being watched from those woods. So I did the only logical thing. I walked away from there and relieved my suffering on the back of the Burma Shave sign. At least I think it was Burma Shave. This was a long time ago. I couldn't shake the feeling of eyes on my back the entire time. When I got back into the truck, Seamus was snoring in the passenger seat. I shook him, but only sort of got him somewhat awake. He kept yammering that he'd seen leprechauns running back and forth on the road, and that they kept making him get lost. I asked him where we were, and he just giggled kind of crazy and told me to ask the leprechauns. That creeped me out completely. So I just let him go back to sleep and started driving. Once I started seeing road signs, I'd figure out where we were and where we needed to be. Then I'd have to call the boss and make some excuse for why Seamus got us lost while I slept on the job. That was not going to be a fun phone call, but it wasn't my problem yet, because first I had to figure out where we even were. It was kind of surprising, the total lack of road signs on this stretch of black tar we were driving on. It seemed like we'd been driving 10 or 20 minutes already, and I'd not seen a single sign along the road, not even a milestone or anything. Just a forest as far as the eyes could see on both sides, and the stars and moon joining with our headlights to guide us. Then I saw it, on the right side of the road. It was the Burma Shave sign. I pulled off and parked in front of it, bursting out of the cab and running around to look at it more closely. It sure looked like the same sign. My gaze fell to the road, and I saw recent tire marks where we had parked earlier. I raced around to the back of the sign, and there it was, still fresh, where I had gone just 10 or 20 minutes earlier. And then that strange feeling returned, the feeling from the woods behind me. I turned suddenly, expecting to see someone there, but all I saw was trees. I was certain I wasn't alone. I looked around at the forest. I saw nothing out of the ordinary. I decided to look lower. What if Seamus really was seeing leprechauns? I saw nothing, but I knew I was still being watched. Insanely, I took one step toward the woods when I heard a low growling. Now we had a standoff. I was afraid to move forward, and someone or something was standing just behind those bushes and trees in front of me, and it was growling. I had to know what it was. I took another step forward, and the growling got louder. Leaves and branches moved and swayed, not down low where a short creature would be, and not at eye level to me either. These branches I saw swaying were above my head. If that was a leprechaun coming out of those woods, it was the tallest leprechaun in history. I actually wanted to take another step forward. My curiosity was so great. This time, however, my knees would not cooperate, and I found myself sitting down on the grass instead. It didn't matter, as whatever it was in the woods had decided already to come all the way out, and I was going to see it in all its glory if I could just keep from blacking out a few moments longer. So I want to point out that when werewolves are in movies, they usually are shown as man-size and savage, but fast and somewhat thin by monster standards. That is not what emerged from these woods. This thing was a slow-moving, incredibly wide, sickeningly tall, hair-covered monster with a face that was sort of a mix between a man's face and a dog's face. It had 2 dog ears, but the rest of the face was an abomination. If it wasn't part human, it must have been part ape or chimp, maybe? It sniffed the air, and I wondered for a second if it might be part wild pig. Its nose wasn't exactly a dog nose or a pig nose or a human nose. If I had to describe it in a few words, I would say dog-headed ape man, but that head was not actually like any sort of dog I've ever seen or would ever hope to see. I was convinced that this was the end, and little black bugs flew around the edges of my vision. I could tell I was blacking out when suddenly someone was pulling me up from behind. It was Seamus trying to save me. I gasped for air and did my best to help him get me in the cab. Then he ran around to the driver's seat, and I could see them. All of them. The huge, slow-moving, incredibly wide and muscular Dogman walked slowly toward the car with a dazed, robot-like expression on its face. The creature was now surrounded with very short, very pale people. The leprechauns, Seamus informed me. I looked at them, and they didn't look like leprechauns to me. They were short, yes, but they had no red beards, and they wore no clothes. Or maybe they were all wearing matching leotards? It was hard to say in the dark. Their eyes seemed slanted and dark. They were too large for their faces, but not cartoonishly large like the space aliens they show on TV. None of them had a single hair upon his head, and they all surrounded our truck, watching us. A giant Dogman and a bunch of tiny men with dark eyes just surrounding us. Seamus started laughing again. Tears ran down both our faces. I wondered what would happen next, and the Dogman suddenly screamed. We woke up the next morning, laying on the grass outside the estate of our rich co-worker throwing the party. We had each other's socks on, and our shoes were on the wrong feet. Neither of us had any memory of undressing or redressing, and to this day we have no explanation for that. But we made it in time for St. Patrick's Day, and nobody really noticed or cared that we were 12 or 16 hours late with the delivery. Nobody ever asked us anything about it, and we all had a great time that St. Patrick's Day. I got married later that year and quit the beer plant to go work with my father-in-law's company, which is where I worked on through the 1980s. To this day, I avoid upstate New York. Their Bigfoot sightings are legendary, of course. I'm not afraid of that. What I'm afraid of are the magical creatures who seem to be interdimensional and seem to be a huge part of the Dogman mystery. I think that entire area is opening into a kind of reality I never want to encounter ever again. I think that area is a doorway to the reality of the Dogman.
Dogman, Bigfoot, standoff. Dear Scary Stories NYC, I want to tell you a story that happened decades ago, back when I was a boy in the 1970s. I was walking home from the creek where I had been fishing, and there, at a crossroads in the forest, I saw an upright bipedal-type dog engaged in a standoff with what most definitely had to be a Bigfoot or a Sasquatch. I don't know how to write as well as a lot of the people who tell you their stories, and I don't think you really need much more background on me or my family's home. The story basically is just the sighting and the fact that I was stuck, unable to get home, while these two big old monsters blocked my way. Okay, so let me try to paint the picture for you. I was heading north up a dirt path, and I was just shy of the path's intersection with an east-west dirt path. In that intersection were the two creatures. Let me try to explain exactly what I was seeing. I'll start with the Sasquatch, or what I think was a Sasquatch or Bigfoot. This was very tall and like a man, but covered in shaggy dark brown fur. It was a lighter colored than a black bear, but darker and redder colored than a grizzly, and its hair was longer than a bear's. It had no fur on its face, and in that sense reminded me of an ape or a monkey. I do think it had the sagittal crest, or whatever that point at the top of the head is supposed to be, although I have to admit, I didn't know about that at the time of the sighting. I might be placing it in my memory using imagination, since I don't remember specifically noting that at the time. Even if it didn't have that feature, it was very much like a tall gorilla with redder hair that stood far more upright than a gorilla is supposed to stand. It was acting furious. Its eyes were open very wide, and it was vocalizing. It was baring its impressive teeth and beating its chest, and it was circling around its opponent. Speaking of that opponent, this was a creature every bit as tall as the Bigfoot, but thinner in spots. It danced around like a boxer in the ring, and I remember being surprised that a dog on its hind legs could be so graceful in its movements. I didn't at the time really comprehend it as a werewolf or a dogman. I just thought it was a very large dog or wolf or dog-wolf hybrid that was standing up and balancing on its hind legs in order to even out the height difference in its quarrel with the Bigfoot. But it was very sure-footed, and looking back on it, I now think that what I witnessed had to have been one of these dogmen that people talk about now so much. This creature reminded me of a German shepherd, except its fur was dark gray and more like the fur of a wolf than that of a German shepherd. It also had wild eyes, and it kept adopting various threatening postures it clearly was trying to frighten the Bigfoot off with. This creature had much larger fangs than the Bigfoot, and it had claw-like hands that looked like daggers were coming out of the ends of it. The Bigfoot's hands, by contrast, looked far more like human hands mixed with ape hands. Its fingers had fingernails at the ends, not claws. In terms of teeth and talons, I would give the Dogman the advantage, but in terms of muscle and sheer strength, the advantage was all that of the slightly taller, but far wider, Sasquatch. Now, these two guys kept taking a few steps left, few steps right, growling at each other, then doing the same thing over and over in only slightly different variations each time. They had reached an impasse. Both of them seemed to be acting as though they were willing to fight over this turf. Yet, neither side had actually done anything worse than growl and glare at the other one so far. As amazing as this scene was, I was a kid and I was hungry and I wanted to get the fish I had caught home, and this cryptid standoff wasn't helping me get there. Sooner or later, my stomach was going to start growling louder than the monsters. Then they might hear it and get more interested in me and my fish than they were in each other. I had to get around them somehow. I decided to walk about 10 or 20 feet into the forest and try to maneuver around them in the woods quietly without either of them noticing. Once I was only about 15 feet into executing this plan, however, I saw that it was not going to work. There, in the forest, not very far in front of me, stood this perfectly still ape man. He was standing like a statue and staring forward, watching the Dogman and the Bigfoot on the crossroads. I hadn't noticed him before, and I bet the Dogman hadn't either. Trying to hold just that still myself, I looked carefully around the forest, and I thought I could make out two more of the large ape-like creatures. They were all standing still and watching the proceedings in front of them. Moving through these woods at that moment would have been too dangerous, so I returned close to my original spot and I sat down behind a boulder. Mostly I listened and rested, but occasionally I looked out to see if anything had changed. It remained a standoff for far longer than I ever would have thought possible. I don't know how long in terms of actual time, but it felt like forever. While I was watching, the most incredible thing happened. It shocked me so much, I had to suppress a gasp. This Bigfoot, even taller than the first one, this second Bigfoot, walked out of the forest right in between the Sasquatch and the Dogman. It was so unnatural, I couldn't believe my eyes. There was no way that Bigfoot could have been there the whole time, and yet it walked out with only one step, so it must have been. How it could have been so invisible while only 2 feet away from the main action, I literally cannot explain to you. That Dogman was as stunned by this as I was. It jumped backward in fear and squealed like a puppy before taking off to my right and disappearing into the forest. At that moment, an even more incredible thing took place. What must have been a dozen or more Sasquatches melted out of their cover, and the entire group of them chased that Dogman into the woods, disappearing in under 3 seconds. They moved supernaturally fast, it seemed, to my young eyes. I ran home, but felt as though I were running through mud. It was really a nightmare. I was so scared and so sad and so jumpy. I was sure one or more of those Bigfoot were going to chase me too. I made it home, and that's about all I can remember of the incident. The strangest part is that I didn't miss a day fishing. I came home a little early for a while, but eventually I just went back to doing things normally, and I never did see a Bigfoot or a Dogman ever again after that night. Well, I hope you liked that because it's my only story of anything paranormal or weird at all. The story of the Dogman, Bigfoot, standoff. Don't go away, we're just getting started. Dogman at the ranch. Dear Scary Stories NYC. My wife and I bought a house to retire in. She calls it a ranch to impress her friends, but it's really just a house located on part of what used to be a ranch. The majority of the land is owned by an actual cattle rancher and is still used for exactly that purpose. We can hear the cows mooing through the fence at night. That is a ranch. We live in a house. On the southern side of our property, the backyard turns into a small forest if you keep walking into it. I'm not sure where our property back there ends and the property of the cow ranch begins, so I haven't really spent much time in that forest. Our daughter came to visit us and brought her 2 young sons with her. They wanted to play catch out in the back, so we all went there to hang out and watch over them. At one point, their ball got away. It rolled and bounced pretty far into the trees, so I asked the kids to wait and told them I would go in and get the ball out for them. It gets dark when the trees are bunched together, even on a sunny afternoon. The air is cooler in the woods, and it smells differently than it does everywhere else outside. I had a weird feeling about it, and I turned back to look at my family. There was my wife. There was my daughter. The 2 of them were having a conversation, ignoring me. It looked like they were in another world out there, as though the sun world were one reality and the forest world was an entirely different dimension in some way. My eyes moved over to my grandsons, and they were both staring back at me with disappointment and impatience. Oh, right, their ball. I had to get their ball. I wandered and strolled deeper into the woods, still not seeing it. It should have stood out easily because it was bright red, and yet I was not noticing it as I scanned the woods, back and forth, up and down. Now I looked back at my family, and they seemed so far away. A chill ran through me, and I felt a sudden urge to finish this business and return to the sunlit reality sooner rather than later. By this point, I began moving bushes to their sides and peering underneath them. Maybe it bounced up and landed in the branches of one of these bushes. While shaking one large plant located tangled in a young tree, I saw the bright red color. Had I found it finally? I had to get down on all fours and reach deep into this bush, feeling around in there, in order to grab at what I thought might be the ball. I got it partially dislodged, but couldn't pull it out. At this point, I needed to catch my breath as I'm not as young as I used to be. When I felt recharged enough, I recommenced the strenuous practice of reaching and straining, with the branches turning my head to the side so I couldn't see what I was doing. It took a few more efforts before I was able to pull the ball out of the place it was wedged and pick it up off the ground. Catching my breath on my knees for a while, I gathered strength and then lifted myself up to a standing position. There, across from me and around 90 feet away, stood another person. This person had come over to see what was going on in that bush. I imagine this person expected that it was some small animal struggling there, and that perhaps this small animal might make a tasty snack. When I stood up and looked at this person, I would say they seemed about as surprised to see me as I was to see them. One of the main reasons I was surprised to see this person is that they were not human. They were some entirely different kind of person, one I had never heard of before, and yet, there they were. We were two different kinds of people from two different worlds. We were never supposed to see each other. We were never supposed to hear about or know about each other. And yet, there we were, staring at each other and studying this odd-looking stranger who shouldn't possibly be. I wondered if this other figure had ever seen one of us before. A human being is what I mean. Because this creature, although judging by facial expression every bit as intelligent as any of us, was very clearly not at all, in any way, human. This was a bipedal animal. It stood very much the way a man or woman stands, but it was fur-covered like a creature of nature, and its head was something more like a dog or a deer than a human. It had a long snout, and the end of its snout held a dog-like black nose. I suppose the fur was brown also like a deer or a dog. The ears stood up on top of its head, more like a kangaroo or deer than a dog probably. They were a little too tall to be a dog's, I would say. The legs that held it up were thicker versions of canine legs. It was just standing there, but I never got the impression it was a four-legged creature standing up on its hind legs. It was a creature that spent its life up on those hind legs, which were quite massive and muscular. I would say they looked as strong as a kangaroo's legs, but they were taller, and it did not appear as though it moved by jumping. I could see it from the tip of its ears on top down to just above what I suppose were its ankles, so I could nearly see all of it. And it was not a kangaroo, not a man, not an ape, not a deer, and not a dog. The fur remained mostly short all over but grew longer on the sides and the back of the head, a little like a small mane. It also seemed to have a somewhat bushy tail. Not knowing what else to do, I wished it a nice day and took a step backward away from it, keeping my eyes on it the entire time. I heard an unhappy sound coming from the dog-head man. He was making this sound as though he were unhappy with me for some reason. His whimpering was growing into a kind of a growl, while never ceasing to sound sad as well. I backed away a few more steps, moving somewhat faster this time. The creature walked 2 or 3 steps toward me. It walked normally, on its back legs. I say normally in the sense that it looked perfectly normal for it to be doing that. It didn't have to hold on to anything to move forward. It had perfect balance, and clearly walked this way all the time. At that point, I noticed an odd thing he was doing with his hands. I'm not sure what else to call them besides hands, although they were not human or primate hands. I guess I might compare them more to raccoon hands. They did have thumbs, and it looked as though they could grab or hold things. Maybe they could even climb. But the long, razor-sharp looking dagger-like nails at the ends of those fingers, those dangerous-looking claws, they were sort of expanding and contracting or opening and closing. I didn't know what that meant. Maybe he needed a hand massage. Maybe he was thinking about doing some damage with those scary-looking things. All I knew was that I didn't want to find out. "Stay!" I shouted at the dogman. "Stay!" I backed off, watching him to see what he would do. What he would do is get annoyed that I was telling him to stay. That's what he would do. I did what anyone else in my situation would do. I shouted, "Fetch!" and I threw the ball way, way over the dogman's head and way deeper into the forest. Then I ran back to my family, not looking back until I was out of the woods. I didn't see it behind me, but I didn't stop running either. I hurriedly rushed everyone inside, saying the Jersey Devil had eaten the ball and it was time to go inside and watch cartoonies instead. That was the last time my wife and I had any, and I mean any, relatives over to our place. It seems they all have kids. We don't want kids here for obvious reasons, so we do a lot of traveling and visit everyone else at their homes. When we're staying at our own place, we stay out of those woods. We stay out of the backyard after dark as well. Sometimes we hear the Dogman walking around in the night out there. Sometimes we hear what we think might be his howl. But so far at least, they haven't bothered us. We have a deal. You see, my wife and I stay out of their woods, and they get to keep my grandson's red ball. California, the land of movie stars, the tech industry, and of course, earthquakes. Not many know that sometimes it is also referenced as one of the many alleged homes of Dogman. There are a lot of natural areas in the state, and as the viewer who sent us this story can attest, some of them are very wild indeed. That's why we call this story the Cascade Canyon Dogman. Dear Scary Stories NYC, I used to live in Sonoma, in the wine-producing area of California, just north of San Francisco when I first retired. From there, I could make day trips or have weekend camping adventures at any number of great wild areas that were very close by. Samuel P. Taylor State Park, French Ranch Open Space Preserve, Ray's Redwoods Preserve, Lorna Alta Open Space Preserve, Baltimore Canyon Open Space Preserve, and the place this story I'm about to tell you took place in, which was Cascade Canyon Open Space Preserve. Now, this is really what it says it is, an open space, and it's preserved. It's a place you park at the edge of, then hike through. As far as I know, you can't drive through it, you've got to hoof it. But if you do, you're guaranteed to see marvelous things. Waterfalls, strange plants, and sometimes, if you're either very lucky or very unlucky, you might get to see strange creatures too. I was there on a cool day in the summer, and when I came upon a small mountain, or a big hill depending on your worldview, I decided to climb it and enjoy the view. I was carrying all the equipment I would need to camp on my back, yet I really hadn't decided if that was what I wanted to do. Like I said, I was spoiled. I knew I could hike out, get some gourmet dinner, and dine at home rather than being in the wild, and it was an extravagance I couldn't at the time get enough of. I had spent my career in a large city back east, and hiking was something that had to be planned too far in advance. At least, hiking in real nature, in nice weather, like we have in abundance out west. I know they say all this land out here will be underwater like Atlantis sooner or later, that it's just a matter of time. To me, that seems even more reason to enjoy what we have while we have it. You never know if it'll still be there tomorrow. And so, on that fine day, I found myself on the top of a little mountain, enjoying the spectacular view in every single direction. And as I contemplated setting up camp, I suddenly decided I'd rather dine at home and watch a movie than rough it in the wild with hot dogs or whatever it was I had brought with me that time. So, rather than unpacking, I braced myself for the climb down instead, and my mouth had already begun watering for the dinner I was thinking about picking up on my way home. I decided to try to go down the mountain on the opposite side of where I had climbed up, just because it was a bit closer to the path I wanted to take back to my car. I cannot overstress how good I was feeling that day. I was in a state of bliss and feeling like the most blessed man on the planet. That was soon to change very drastically. About a third of the way down the climb, I became aware of dirt falling on top of me, and I found it curious. Rather than letting up, the situation grew worse, as now I was being pelted with dirt and small pebbles, and I worried that I was underneath some kind of avalanche in progress. I looked up and I saw some kind of figure, briefly, silhouetted against the noonday sun. I shouted at whoever it was that they were accidentally kicking dirt on me, but I got a mouthful of dirt as a reward for my effort. This annoyed me, so I cleared my throat and got ready to fully express my unhappiness with the behavior of this fellow up above me, when I caught sight of the man's face. This man's face was not a man's face. This man's face was a dog's face, but he was standing up on a ledge above me, looking down on me. I couldn't believe what my eyes were witnessing. This was a dog-headed man, and he clearly didn't want me on his little hill. My first thought was that I was imagining it, that I was suffering heat stroke, that maybe I was dehydrated. But it wasn't that warm, and I had been drinking plenty of water. I thought back on my diet for the day, and I hadn't eaten anything from nature. Nothing store-bought should be making me start to see things. I shouldn't be hallucinating, but at the same time, I couldn't possibly be seeing what I was seeing, because upright walking canines are not a kind of animal that actually exists. Having reassured myself that this couldn't possibly be happening, I looked up again at the Dogman. He seemed to believe somewhat firmly that he did in fact exist in a most robust manner, and he was quite frustrated that I was still there, where he clearly did not want me to be. I saw him angrily begin climbing down the mountain directly above me. Fear shot through my heart. I was about to be finished by something that didn't exist. I was going to become one of those people that nobody will ever be able to say what happened to. I was going to become a missing 411 kind of guy. I was never going to get to enjoy my gourmet dinner over some fine local Napa Valley wine. I was never even going to make it out of this park. Looking behind and beneath me, I saw a ledge below about 25 feet down. If I could jump down to that ledge and land without injury, I could easily jump the 10 feet down to the next ledge and make a run for it down the path leading off the mountain. But that was a big if, being able to do it without hurting myself. If I twisted an ankle or broke a leg bone, then I was going to be a sitting duck, waiting there for the Dogman to carve up into lunch meat. For the first time in my sophisticated, holier-than-thou metropolitan life, I prayed. It occurred to me in that moment I had no actual life. I just had a lifestyle. Or maybe I should say I was a lifestyle. I wasn't really alive. I understood this because in those moments deciding where to aim myself when I jumped, accepting that this was probably going to hurt no matter what happened, that was the time when I truly began to be alive. Sometimes accepting your end may be near can bring you most directly into the present moment. I leaped, and I landed, and I didn't hurt myself at all. Looking up, I saw I had gained some ground on the Dogman, but he was going to catch up still. He seemed to be built for climbing. His massive muscles led down to incredibly strong hands and feet that seemed to be able to grip any surface and climb with greater ease than any human possibly could. We have to wear shoes, but that thing has feet that grip the rock. He could not only move faster, but he could move more steadily than I could dream of moving. Panicked, I jumped down to the next level without looking and landed just a foot away from another guy who had been in the process of walking up the path. He cursed me out as I lay on the ground, having slipped and fallen. I was checking myself for broken bones, but seemed to be okay. His continued shouting at me had become somewhat exasperating. Still out of breath and unable yet to respond in words, I pointed up the mountain. The man followed my finger and looked directly up into the eyes of that dog-headed athlete above us. He was standing on the ledge that I had jumped off of, regarding both of us. The other man exclaimed something in shock and horror, and I smiled. I would have laughed if I could have. Frozen in fear, the man appeared utterly flummoxed and unsure what to do. Panting, I told him that the monster won't pursue us if we stay together. Sure enough, we both dusted ourselves off and walked down the path, and the monster stayed right where he was, watching us leave. That was not the last time I went hiking in the area, but I never went alone again. I've since moved up to Washington State, where I expect to someday see a Bigfoot. However, since that day hiking just north of San Francisco, I've never seen any kind of strange creature ever again. And that is my story of the time I saw the Cascade Canyon Dogman. The Dogman of Godfrey Road. Dear Scary Stories NYC. I'm a big fan of Dogman, and I have been for decades. I read Linda Godfrey's famous Beast of Bray Road book back when it was first published, and I've only become more interested in the subject since then. There was a point when I briefly stayed with the family of a friend in upstate New York while we were traveling cross-country. We were walking with his sister and her dog to the dog park near them when I looked at the map and asked if we could go down Godfrey Road. They asked why, and I half-jokingly said it was because I wanted to see a werewolf or a dogman. They both knew who Linda Godfrey was, so they got my joke, although neither of them thought it was particularly funny. They decided to play a trick on me, though, and even though it was out of our way, They walked the dog and me over to and down Godfrey Road. It turns out it's pretty heavily forested, or it was that day at least, and even though it was a bright and sunny day, they both were acting scared and making up stories about how sometimes Dogman would chase people down Godfrey Road and all that kind of stuff. I knew they were joking. Well, I was pretty sure they were joking, but they were still giving me the creeps. If it had been night, I probably would have taken off running. I would have been too scared, but it was the middle of the day, and so I was doing my best to laugh off their kidding. Still, I wished we could get through this woods and get to the stupid dog park, and that is what we eventually did. On the way back, I begged them to go the shorter route. I really did not want to walk down Godfrey Road while the sun was going down. Dusk is a really good time to see a dogman, or a really bad time since they most likely are out hunting and scavenging at that hour. I even suggested we call and have the stepfather come pick us up, but it was a no-go. They could see I had gotten myself pretty scared and they couldn't resist bringing me back along the wooded Godfrey Road. I had very little sense of direction of the area and I didn't want to risk walking alone through an unfamiliar town. So I just went along, bracing myself for the walk. After all, Dogman wasn't real, so what was the worst that could happen? Unless Dogman was real. But this was upstate New York, so if we were going to see something weird up there, it was probably going to be a Bigfoot. I filled my head with these kinds of thoughts because it kept me from getting too frightened. My friend and his sister were a little too giggly walking back through the dark woods, and I began to wonder if they had planned a trick to scare me. When I heard something behind us, emerging from the trees onto Godfrey Road, I said, "Oh no," right out loud. I figured the game was afoot. Turning around, I saw not a person, but a huge animal emerging from the woods on the right. It was so big, I thought it was a horse. I think I even said that, "Look, a horse," or something to that effect. It was an all-white horse I thought I was seeing, ghost-like, emerging from the woods. Except by a second or two later, I saw the savagery of the face of the tall, long-legged beast, and I could see it was something else entirely. Behind me, my friend's sister screamed like an actress in a horror movie. I heard her and her dog running away. Meanwhile, I was standing in the center of the road, just trying to understand what the trick was. The creature was now almost completely onto the road, and it was like a giant dog. I guess it was a giant dog. That's what it looked like, and what else looks like a giant dog? It caught sight of me watching it and turned sharply, at first lowering its head almost to the ground and baring its teeth, snarling. Then, sickeningly, rearing back, raising its eye level over the top of some of the younger trees nearby. This thing, standing on its back legs, reminded me of a mastiff mixed with a bulldog, but the fur was all white. Just a uniform white, short-haired. The eyes seemed deranged or angry or stressed somehow. The front paws were splayed out, almost as though they were hands, but not quite. The animal seemed strong as an elephant, and yet sickly somehow. It was both thin and broad, depending where you looked, and scary all over. It was standing just down the road, but it looked like Ray Harryhausen animation or something. There was an unreal quality to it that might have just been my sense of shock, or the fact that I wished I wasn't seeing what I was seeing. I turned around to see if my friend was seeing what I was seeing, but he had already run off and was almost out of view. I decided I'd better follow him, and I did. I never looked behind me, as I think just seeing that thing following me might have done me in without it having to lay a finger on me. When I caught up with the others, they seemed pretty shaken up. My friend's sister cried intermittently for the rest of the night, and neither of them were in a joking mood any longer. If what we saw was some kind of a trick, it was a trick played on them as well as on me. Was this something manufactured by our imaginations? If I had never pointed out that the road shared a name with the author of the first Dogman book, would this creature have manifested at all? Having never again seen anything of this sort for the rest of my life so far, that's about all I can tell you concerning the Dogman of Godfrey Road. Ah, love, is there any sweeter thing? Until it turns bad, that is. Nothing could possibly feel better than knowing you are loved. Then, when you find out you're being played, nothing could possibly hurt more. When in love, we are inspired to great achievements which further the culture of the entire species of humanity. When we realize that we've been spurned and dumped, though, we can be inspired to commit acts so loathsome and repellent that in retrospect, we can't even believe that was us doing those things. This is the story of a guy in love who was not loved back. He got desperate and he did things he shouldn't have done, and then he got punished for his misdeeds from a most unlikely source. The Dogman. Today's story is called Dogman Caught Me Spying on My Ex. Dear Scary Stories NYC, I'm going to tell you a story about the Dogman that I've literally never told anyone before. It's the most embarrassing thing that ever happened to me, or really the most embarrassing behavior I've ever exhibited, and how it somehow brought me in contact with a horrific beast which I have no choice but to describe as a Dogman. There was this girl in my college when I was a freshman that had the most lovely laugh. It sounded like music to me, and her face was the most beautiful sight in nature's history as far as I was concerned. Let's call her Annette. I considered Annette way out of my league. Not because of social class, in fact my parents were richer than her parents, but because she was so beautiful and I was such a nerdy little trollkin. She was taller than I was, which was a problem, at least in my mind. And she could sing, and she was athletic. I was lucky to walk down the block without tripping over my own 2 feet. I couldn't carry a tune, and I'm never going to win any beauty contests. Needless to say, my self-esteem wasn't very high either. So, when she asked if she could sit with me at lunch, I thought she was making fun of me. I should have stuck with that instinctual assumption. It would have saved me a lot of heartache. But then this story wouldn't have happened, and I wouldn't have this incredibly embarrassing tale to tell you today. I don't remember ever asking her out. I wouldn't have had the nerve, and I wouldn't have had the courage. She asked me if I wanted to go see a particular movie she was interested in. When I said yes, she said she would go with me, but She couldn't afford the theater ticket. I offered to pay for her, and then we went. During the movie, she decided we would sit in the back, which at first annoyed me. How could I get the full experience of the audio from the back right of the theater? But when she started necking with me 10 minutes into the film, I realized there was no place I would rather be. Soon, she asked me if I wanted to try a restaurant she was interested in. Then, we went to see bands that she wanted to see, always with me paying, and always with a little cuddling and making out thrown in, initiated by her each time. I considered myself very lucky. Not only was she affectionate, but she didn't seem to be embarrassed to be seen with me in public. My self-esteem was greatly boosted. My grades went up. I made more friends, and I was beginning to learn what it felt like to be happy. Then, one day, I was walking around my neighborhood running errands for my mother, and I saw Annette from a distance. I almost called out to her, but then I saw she was with a really tall, really handsome, model-type guy. I slowed down and watched the two of them from a distance, wondering who this guy was. Maybe it was her brother, I thought. She told me she had an older brother and I had never met him. Then, she leaned in and kissed him right on the lips, and I knew this was not her brother. I used to kiss my mom on the cheek and sometimes on her shoulder when we hugged. I've seen people kiss their family members on top of the head, too. I've never seen anyone kiss their brother on the lips, though. Well, maybe he's her ex-boyfriend, I thought next. Sometimes people will continue to kiss on the lips after breakups. This could be that sort of thing. Then, she wrapped her arms around him and began kissing him in a way that let me know he might be her boyfriend, but he was in no way her ex. I did something foolish. I stormed over there and asked her what was going on. I kind of made a scene. I felt betrayed. I was betrayed, and I wanted to know how long she had been with this guy. He, in turn, wanted to know how long she had been involved with me. I think he called me a little worm. She got flustered and told him I didn't mean anything to her and that she was about to break up with me anyway. She didn't tell me that she wanted to break up. She told that guy that she already had planned to dump me. That's one of the more painful ways to find out you've lost your girl, believe me. Since then, I've been dumped about 4 other ways, but that one still holds the world record for being most painful. I yelled at her, and the guy shoved me and threatened to do worse. I left, utterly defeated, furious, and broken. We had plans to go to a concert that Friday, and I went instead with one of my guy friends. I saw her in the crowd with that new guy and went home to cry myself to sleep. I was miserable for about a week, and then I started getting angry. She had built up my self-esteem enough that I knew I deserved better treatment than that, and I grew angrier and more manic each day. Instead of accepting that it was over, I kept wishing bad things would happen to the tall model man, and that I would have a second chance to date Annette. One night, I did the dumbest thing I've ever done, and even all these years later I'm still embarrassed to talk about it, even anonymously. I went to where I knew she was renting a room, and I spied on her through the back window. Besides being wrong, besides being intrusive, besides being against the law and all moral boundaries, it was also pointless. Nothing good could have possibly come from me spying on her. It wasn't going to bring her back to me, and it wasn't like I would see anything that would make me feel better. I'd either see nothing interesting or I'd see stuff that would make me angry or sad. So why did I do it? I'm not even sure. I think love makes us insane, and being dumped gives us this feeling of victimhood that we feel grants us more rights than everyone else. Whenever we place our happiness in someone else's hands, we're doing a dangerous and stupid thing, something that can't possibly turn out well for us at all, in any way. So there I was, in a filthy backyard, in a dirty neighborhood by the woods, peeking through a dusty window into the back of a crappy apartment. I saw movement in there, but couldn't figure out what was going on. I don't know how long I was there, but it must have been a while. I was so lost in trying to make out details inside that I didn't hear someone walking up behind me until it was too late, and a huge hand slammed down on my shoulder. I turned around in shock, expecting to find the landlord or her new boyfriend, but what I saw instead was a massive, hairy chest. I looked up and up and up, and then I saw what looked more like a dog's head than anything else. How I managed to not scream at that sight, I don't know, but somehow I slipped out from under his hand, and we began this odd waltz sort of a dance, circling around each other. That was a real animal head. It was not a mask. It had a real tongue, and it was drooling. The eyes seemed lit from within, but not in an artificial way. Maybe sort of like fireflies or lightning bugs, but they didn't blink, they stayed on. Just a soft glow, not a full-on bright light or anything. I was looking up at his face, so I don't remember noticing much about the body, but like I said, it had hands, or paws that closely resembled hands. The ears were dog ears on top of its head instead of on the sides like normal. It had a dog nose at the end of a very long snout, almost an anteater kind of a snout. It was nearly that long. I want to pause now and say I've wondered for years why it came up to me like that and put its claw on my shoulder that way. If it were just an animal, I would expect it to either keep walking past me or else try to attack and eat me. But this Dogman did that very odd, very human thing of grabbing me on the shoulder so that I would turn around. My two main theories as to why it might have done that are that maybe I was blocking its way. Maybe it liked to peep through that window. Or else, maybe this was the true form of her new boyfriend. Maybe this wasn't a Dogman at all, but a werewolf instead. A shapeshifter, in other words. I faked the monster out to my left, then ran to my right, toward the back fence. I wanted to go to the left side of the fence where a picket was missing so I could escape. That was how I had gotten in. The Dogman was blocking me from going that way, though. So I ran to my right, toward the back of the big shed back there, built by the tall picket fence. I was going to try to climb the fence, but when I got back there, I saw there was actually a space of maybe 2 feet between the shed and the fence, and it extended back, I guess, 10 or 12 feet. It was barely wide enough for me to fit in sideways, but I hoped it would be too narrow for the Dogman to fit in. I squeezed in a few feet and immediately got covered in spider webs, including spiders and bugs the spider had caught, which were possibly dead. It was just gross, but I kept sliding in because a second later, that Dogman was there, reaching into the space and trying to grab me. His first swipe scratched me on the cheek, but he was unable to get a hold of me. I slid all the way to the back of the space, and that creature absolutely flipped out. He banged on the picket fence, which went up taller than me. It reverberated, so it was like the fence was giving me a full body punch, then giving me extra space to breathe, then another full body punch over and over and over again. I wondered if the fence would hold, or if the dog-headed man was going to break it down in his rage. Bugs crawled all over me, and I couldn't move my arms to scratch most of my itches. I just prayed that whatever was biting me wasn't poisonous, and I tried to stay as far back by the wall as I could so that it would hurt less when that fence whacked me in the face over and over. The creature stopped pounding the fence and gave an ear-piercing dog howl. Then it went right back to beating on that fence. At that moment, I heard a woman screaming. Was that Annette? I heard a man yelling and another woman screaming. I didn't recognize any of the voices. The dogman stopped pounding on the wooden fence and looked back toward the house. Then I heard him sort of bark and growl at the same time toward whoever was screaming back there. That, in turn, caused more screaming, and then a small explosion with a ricochet. Was someone firing at it? The dogman did an incredibly athletic sideways leap over the fence, and I could hear him running off back into the forest from where he had most likely come. I, on the other hand, stayed right where I was, bugs and all. If I walked out there, the story would shift from "we saw a monster in our backyard" to "a monster caught a prowler in our backyard." I had no choice but to stay exactly where I was until the hubbub had died down. And that took quite some time. A number of the people were now in that yard talking about what they had seen, comparing notes. One of them said that the monster was black. The other said it was brown. They all agreed about the strange glowing eyes, and that it had huge fangs like something from prehistoric times. One said, "That was Bigfoot." Another said, "It had a dog head." And a third said, "It was a Bigfoot with a long snout." I figured, sooner or later, one of those people was going to come over and peer down the crevice and see me hiding there. I had to do something to hide myself. I thought about crouching down in the corner, but I realized there wasn't enough space for me to bend my knees. Looking around desperately, I spied an extra picket laying down on the ground under last year's autumn leaves at my feet. The bottom of the picket was near me, and the top was pointing toward the opening where the dogman had been. I stepped on the very edge of the picket and tried to tilt it upward. It worked to an extent, but I could only lift it a few feet that way. If I could tilt the picket up all the way, I might be able to hide myself behind it. That's when I hit on an idea. If I could tilt myself to my left and balance on one foot, I might be able to grab the picket and tilt it the rest of the way up. I could push on the fence in front of me to try to prevent myself from falling over. Having no other choice, I began to try doing just this. I found myself with my torso parallel to the ground and my right leg up in the air, knee pushing hard against the back of the fence as I reached as hard as I could for that picket. Sweat dripped in my eyes and burned badly, but I couldn't wipe it away. I either was going to grab that picket or I was going to end up in jail and shamed for life. I could hear the people in the yard now asking each other what the dogman was interested in behind the shed. Was it a cat? Was it an animal trapped back there? Maybe they should go rescue the poor animal. I was running out of time. With an extreme bend, I grabbed the wood, hurting myself in my side with the exertion. I now pushed against the fence and began to try to shift my center of gravity so I could get back up to a standing position and bring the wooden board with me. Dragging the wood up with my left hand, I scraped my knuckles badly on the back concrete wall of the old shed, but I didn't stop pulling. I remember my eyes opened very wide as it took all my willpower not to scream from the pain I was inflicting on my knuckles and the throbbing and stabbing pains I was feeling in my side. I got the picket in place, and tears ran down my face from the various pains I had just inflicted upon myself. I could hear the people from the building coming closer. I heard them talking to each other. Well, if something was back there, it's long gone now. And then I heard them walk back toward the house. What are you guys doing out there? Came a new voice from inside. It was Annette. She was just now noticing that something was going on in the backyard. They all told the story from the start to her all over again. She asked if she should call the police. No, I thought, panicked. No, please don't call the police. Yet the others discussed it. Maybe they should call the police, said a man. Maybe the police would just think we're all crazy, said a woman. It was decided that since the monster had left, they'd be better off just going back to bed, but that they would ask the landlord to install a nightlight for the backyard to discourage something like this from happening again. I hung on every word, because my entire future depended on them making decisions favorable to me. I waited for over an hour after they had gone back inside before I let the picket slip back down and made my painful way out of my itchy hiding spot. Then I went home and took a very long hot shower. The next day, just by chance, I ran into Annette in town. She was alone this time, and she saw the scratches on my face and my knuckles. She lectured me that I was violent and crude, always getting into fights. I didn't bother to correct her. It was much better that she thought I had been in a fist fight than if she knew the truth, which was that Dogman caught me spying on my ex-girlfriend. Welcome to Scary Stories NYC. I'm Henry Lee Dogman, filling in for your old pal Bigfoot. Tonight we've got a couple of new stories about some relatives of mine who ran afoul of those hairless apes again. Oh, I'm sorry, I meant human beings. I forgot some of you out there were also humans. We cryptids hold you humans in utmost regard. You're our fan club after all, and where would monsters be without our fans? Which leads us to our first story, in which a fan of movie werewolves encounters a real-life something, which could only be described as a movie monster come to life. Dear Scary Stories NYC, I grew up loving monster movies. I always identified with them more than with the humans in the films. I had movie posters of scary movies all over my bedroom walls, and all my friends were also monster fans. And my favorite monsters of all used to be the werewolves. That is, until the night when I almost collapsed in fear at the sight of what had to have been a real-life Dogman. One of my best friends, who we can call Otto, lived about a 12-minute walk from my family's house. Both houses are still to this day in both families, so I guess I'd better leave out the location. It was a nice suburban area, close to the country, but also close enough to a major city that my mom could work there while my dad worked at home and took care of us. So one day, Otto came over to see me and talked me into walking back to his house. Otto wanted us to take a slightly different path than the one we normally took. He said it only added a couple of minutes to the walk, but he wanted to show me something. On this other, slightly richer-looking street he took me down, there was a long, tall hedge on the side of the sidewalk. I mean, it was so tall, there was nobody who could have looked over this. Before we walked past it, Otto took me to an entrance in the hedge on the corner and told me to look inside. It was a field of grass, a really big field. I think there was a house to my right all the way down, but I don't even remember for sure. The grass yard was big enough to erect a house on it, but it was too well kept to be a vacant lot. I assume it must have been the very large yard of a house located further down the block, out of my view. I looked, then shrugged my shoulders at Otto, wondering why he was making me look at this yard behind the tall hedge. He nudged me, and we walked down the sidewalk with the hedge to our right. "There's nothing scary about this block at all, is there?" asked Otto. The question confused me. It was a sunny, warm day. Birds were singing. We were walking past a neatly manicured hedge stretching way up over our heads on our right. We were kids with the afternoon off. This was about as close to heaven as life was going to get, and even back then I think we both had an appreciation of that. Of course, there was nothing scary at all about any of this. "Scary?" I asked back, unable to come up with a more intelligent reply. "Exactly," shouted Otto, making my heart skip a beat. "Exactly right. Not scary at all. But I'll bet you $3.50 that you won't be able to walk this block back to your home tonight after dark." "After dark?" I asked. And why $3.50? Why not $3 or $5? "$3.50's all I've got," answered Otto, pulling change out of his pocket and counting it. "I think it's actually $3.48 the last time I counted." "Okay, whatever." I motioned for him to put his handful of change away. "Why would I be unable to walk down this block at night? Do big kids hang out here or something?" "Something even worse than that," Otto told me, acting all dramatic. I was pretty sure he was joking around, but he never wanted to bet money unless it was a sure thing. I figured that meant if I went along with any of this, the joke would be on me. Still, I was curious what his plan was, so I decided to play along and try to get more information out of him. There had to be someone else involved if it was a trick, and I wondered who that might be. So, as we walked the long block next to the hedge, Otto pointed out the old houses across the street, each elegant in an Addams Family kind of way, each inhabited by the same families for longer than my family had even lived in this town. I imagined the insides of those places as a mixture of museum and dungeon. There were probably embarrassing relatives in cages in the attic and lost manuscripts that would explain the history of the universe if only someone thought to translate them. Oh, and Cousin It, definitely somewhere in one of those old school McMansions was Cousin It. Otto told me that one night he walked on this block home from my house, and in the dark, the block is a lot scarier than during the day. The houses over there, they creak as though someone is walking along following your movements, he told me. Then, on the hedge side, somehow it really sounds as though there's someone on the other side of the hedge. When you take steps, they take steps. I figured it must be an echo, but the sound never exactly matched my footsteps. I was walking on a sidewalk, and whatever that was, walked on the grass. It's kind of like how it would sound if someone was trying to sound like they were your echo, you know? As if someone is trailing you, but he wants you to think it's just an echo. Now I was intrigued. It didn't sound like a trick to me anymore. It sounded like Otto really found this block creepy to walk down at night. I was very curious and decided maybe I would walk this way on my trip home. We got to the corner and I wanted to look in at the lawn again, but there didn't seem to be any opening on the side closer to Otto's home. I told him I would try it on the way back that night because if I heard the footsteps when I got to my end of the block, I could peek around the corner on the far side and see if there really was anyone in there. Not only did that serve to call off Otto's $3.48 bet, but he told me he would give me $1 if I peeked around the edge to see what was there on my way home. As the day wore on, Otto grew more excited than I was about walking the hedge, as we had already begun to call it. He asked his mom and I asked mine if Otto could stay at my house that night. This way we could walk the hedge together and both get to see if anything really was on the other side. By this point, I was pretty sure it wasn't a trick. Otto wouldn't have wanted me to be there too if it was just a dirty trick on me. So the bravery of the sunlit afternoon turned into the ominous darkness and unending cricket chirping of a country suburban night. Otto's mom could see our reticence about hitting the road, and she offered to drive me home. That woke us up that we'd better either do this or chicken out, one way or the other. We decided to proceed with our original plan and began our walk like men marching to the gallows. We were silent most of the way. Otto looked genuinely frightened long before we got to the hedge block. By the time we did reach it, though, we were both silent. Our eyes were opened wide. We put one careful step in front of another, and we took care to notice every detail of everything around us. We were so aware of all of it that when a piece of paper blew down the block, I noticed we were both following it with our eyes, reading the print off it as it flitted past. It was a notice for a lost dog. Crossing the block, I could already hear the old McMansions creaking on the other side of the street. Walking in this direction, we now had the tall hedge to our left. Upon entering onto the sidewalk, I really could hear an echo to the left that I could not hear during the day. I stopped walking, but Otto continued, and so did the echo. Surprised, he stopped and looked at me silently, with giant saucer eyes. I walked over to him, and there was no echo, none at all. He took a step, and it sounded like someone stepped on dry grass on the other side of the hedge. "Maybe it's your shoes," I whispered, but as I did, I could hear something moving on the other side of the hedge, as though someone were trying to reach through it at me. Both our jaws hung slack. This was far scarier than any scary movie. But I didn't like this kind of fear, I realized. I started to wonder if we were in genuine danger somehow. Otto took a step as quietly as he could, but I could hear something on the other side put its foot down simultaneously to him. He took another step, and another, and each time the echo was right there. Letting out a terrified whimper, Otto took off running down the block, crying and screaming. I could hear something running along with him on the other side of the tall hedge. I took off after him, catching up in 3 or 4 strides. Otto could not run very fast. I passed him before we reached the end of the block, and I remember turning around and looking into that opening in the tall hedge. And what I saw made me turn pale. I only looked long enough to see. Then I took off running home faster than before, because what I saw keeping pace with my friend was a very tall, very crazy looking, dog-headed, Sasquatch kind of thing. I mean, it absolutely was not something I had been expecting to see at all. It was debatable which one of us was screaming louder now. We had both abandoned all dignity in favor of screaming like little babies and weeping as we ran away in fear. But you would have run too. This creature was almost as tall as the hedge. It looked like something that ate meat professionally. I mean, this was not a vegetarian. Its wolf-like head and gnarly, matted fur with long, clawed, hand-like paws came directly out of all of our nightmares. It was not down on all fours. It was running after us like a werewolf version of Freddy Krueger. It was so much larger than we were, with such a longer leg span. We had no chance to outrun it, and I think I knew it. As we rounded a corner to the left, we were met by blinding, bright lights in our eyes. I couldn't see where I was going, and then I heard my mother's voice. Squinting into the lights, I saw she was there in her car. Otto and I practically flew inside and looked to where the Dogman had been. It must have turned back when it saw the lights. I asked my mother if she had seen it. She just laughed at me and made a U-turn, taking us home. Otto asked me what was chasing us, and I realized he had never seen it either. I asked him how he missed it, and he told me he was too scared to turn around and look. I told him what I saw, and he refused to give me my $1 because he said things like that don't exist. Otto thinks that when my mom laughed, that meant she didn't see the Dogman either, but I kind of felt like adults are mysterious, and nobody really knows what their weird reactions mean. It seems like I was the only one to see the Dogman, and I was pretty frightened at the time. Could it have been one of the bigger kids in a costume playing a prank on us? Or even one of the parents? I can't say I saw the creature long enough to be certain it wasn't something like that. I sure wish Otto had been brave enough to turn and look. Neither of us ever had the nerve to walk down that block in the dark ever again. And now we're both grown. So I'll never really know if what I saw was real or not. The time I saw a movie monster come to life. Dogman stared at my neighbor's rooster. Dear Scary Stories NYC. I have a story that took place in Yonkers in the late 1970s. I lived in a somewhat suburban area on the more working class side of town. We all owned private homes, but they were packed together close with small backyards. Our neighbors diagonally in the back had rescued a rooster from the park and were trying to give it a nice home to get old in. The rooster was pretty crazy though, because of whatever they rescued it from, so it would crow all day and all night at random hours. Each time it did, that would set off our dogs to barking, and that would get my father upset at everyone. It reached the point where none of us slept more than 3 or 4 hours at a time, and I found myself up at 3 or 4 in the morning one time, trying to get sleepy enough to go back to bed. I was looking out the window on the second floor, and I could see the neighbor's rooster through the back fence. It was sleeping like a baby in that upright way birds can sleep. I wished I could go wake it up the way it had done me so many times. That one bird had the entire neighborhood tired and on edge. Then I noticed that I wasn't the only one looking at the rooster. To my left, just over in the other neighbor's backyard, stood a tall figure that I could see the top of in profile. It seemed to be a dog, and it also seemed to be eyeing that same bird that I was. I should have thanked the Lord and hoped that it ate the rooster for dinner, but I'm an idiot, and so my first thought was, I have to save the rooster. Smart, huh? So instead of shutting up and allowing nature to take its course, I banged this little wooden toy bat I had on the wooden windowsill as loudly as I could. The dog turned fast to stare at me in fear and anger, realizing there was someone else involved in this scene. As it turned to face me head on, I could see that it had very broad, man-like shoulders. It moved branches and leaves out of its line of vision with what looked to be an arm with a claw-like hand on the end of it. This was very disorienting. The thing had to be standing up on its hind legs in order for its front paws to be free to clear things away from its eyes. This was not just a dog. I slammed the window shut and ran back to bed. I pulled the covers up over my head and shivered myself to sleep. I slept like a baby, and right through my alarm clock. So did the rest of the family. The rooster, it hadn't crowed all night. It turned out the bird had disappeared in the night, and after that night, it was never seen again. The neighbors thought it had escaped, and I never told them otherwise. In fact, I never told anyone any part of this story before, out of guilt. I felt I knew what had happened to that rooster, and I felt like I could have prevented it from happening. The time that I saw Dogman staring at my neighbor's rooster. Hope Henry Lee Dogman did a good job of filling in for a change. Dogman, or delusion. Dear Scary Stories NYC, my son started telling me he was seeing Dogman last year. He said he saw the creature outside the window in his room. My son sleeps on the second floor, so I didn't see how this could be anything but his imagination. Then he started seeing it all over the place, and the whole thing began to creep me out. One of the only things I've learned so far as a father is to make sure not to overreact to things your kid goes through. Listen to him, consider what he says, but don't freak out about it or worry. Just work with his mom to figure out the most logical thing to do in reaction, then stick with that plan. Never treat a small issue as though it were the end of the world, and when actual emergencies come up, that's actually the most important time to react calmly. I felt as though I were doing a good job of sticking to my plan of not worrying or making mountains out of molehills, but when it came to the subject of my son claiming Dogman was watching him wherever he went, I have to admit I was genuinely creeped out. The subject gave me the shivers, and I had no conscious, logical reason to feel so strongly about it. One time, the boy was playing in the sunroom and called to me that Dogman was there. When I got to the room, my son was staring off at the gate to our backyard, which was swinging open. He told me the Dogman had just run out the gate. That freaked me out, I admit. What kind of a dog opens a gate? I asked him to please explain to me in detail what this Dogman looked like. He told me he looks like he's really angry, and he looks like he wants to eat you up for dinner. When he said that, it felt like icicles were going up and down my spine. I asked him to tell me what it looks like, as in, does it look like a man or a lizard or what? He giggled at the idea that the Dogman would look like a lizard, then told me the Dogman looks like a dog. I asked, why not just call him a dog then? Why a dog man? He had to think about that. Then he said, that's just his name, Dogman. My wife overheard us and laughed. Then she left and came back with a children's book. There was a cartoon drawing on the hard cover of a dog in a police uniform holding hands with some tiny orange thing. I read the title aloud. Dogman, Lord of the Fleas, from the creator of Captain Underpants? That's what it said. I held the book up to my son, and I asked him if that was what Dogman looked like. He laughed and said no, then said yes, but that was a different Dogman. I asked him if he knew where there was a picture of something that the Dogman outside his window looked like. He said yes, and went to our old shelf of ancient VHS tapes. He pulled a few out, then put them back, clearly looking for a specific old film. Finally, he said, "Ta-da!" and pulled out one tape, bringing it over to me and his mother. On the cover, it said, The Howling Part 4. It was a werewolf movie from the late 1980s. The box cover features a painting of a hairy man with long, sharp-looking nails on his fingers and a kind of a humanoid dog's head on top. The mouth was open to reveal razor-sharp teeth. The ears were tall on top and came up to points, and the eyes looked as though they were glowing yellow. It was a Dogman, the kind people report on the internet these days. "This is your fault," my wife scolded me. "You let him watch too many monster movies." Then she started this rant about how she wanted every horror movie removed from the house before the morning and all this other unreasonable nonsense. The boy ran to his room crying, and somehow that was supposedly my fault as well. I went up to his room to see if I could help, and he told me not to worry, that he was never going to tell anyone about the Dogman ever again. I asked him why not, and he said that now Mom hated both of us and was going to leave us, and it was his fault because he talked about the Dogman. She really laid a nasty head trip on this poor kid, with her conviction that she was never wrong and her impatience with any deviation from her arbitrary rules. If he weren't doing something she could brag about to her catty friends on Failbook, then you were a drain on her social standing. She would lecture the poor boy about his rudeness. Then when he responded, she would just openly go back to staring, slack-jawed, at her Failbook app on her phone while the kid was still talking. One time, he asked her if she was even listening to him. When we both went silent and stared at her, waiting for a response, she realized she'd been asked a question. Then she tried to remember what the kid said and took a chance answering. Of course, her answer proved that she wasn't listening at all, and then she was trying to cover it up by lying to her own son. I don't use social media, and I don't allow my son to either. I think it deadens people's souls and reduces them to zombie automatons with severe stress to compete for status with the most narcissistic and vapid people they know. But maybe it's only like that for my wife. Anyway, we got yelled at as though we had done something wrong each time she got caught lying or breaking one of her other rules that she enforced on me and my son. I carried him up to his room, and she was too lost staring at her phone to even notice we had left. I could still hear her yelling at people who weren't there as I was closing my kid's door. He and I had a talk. I wanted him to know that he could always tell me what was going on with the Dogman or anything else, but that we should probably both keep that kind of stuff a secret from his mom. I told him she was only acting angry because the Dogman made her scared. Anger and fear are two sides of the same thing, so if you see someone being angry, try to figure out what they're scared of that's causing this unhappiness. My son thought about that for a while and said, "No, Dad, she's angry at us because the people in her phone don't think Dogman is cool." He went on to explain his feeling to me that the people in Mom's phone are more important than he and I are, and they are very hard to make happy. When we act uncool, it makes Mom's life so much harder. I was stunned that the poor guy interpreted her bad parenting as her being a victim of him not being a good enough kid. I really wished I could take her phone and smash it, but she'd have it replaced within an hour. About 2 months ago, my mother came to stay with us for about a week. She's been touring the country this year, staying with different family members as she moves around. Now, my mother has a history stretching way back of not getting along very well with my wife, but they made it through the week fine this time since my wife never lifted her face out of her phone. On the third or fourth night, however, I was awakened by a loud scream coming from the hallway outside of my room. I saw my wife was in bed next to me, so I knew it must have been my mother. Running out, I found Mom backing out of the bathroom, staring back in at something she seemed terrified of. By the time I got there, she said it had run away. I asked her to tell me what she saw, and she told me I wouldn't believe her. I saw my son running to the TV room, and I knew what he was going to get. He came back and held the VH cover of The Howling Part 4 up to his grandma, who gasped and held her hand over her mouth. "How did you know what I saw?" she asked her grandson. Since I had never told my mother about the monster my son was claiming to see, and since my wife and my mother never speak unless they absolutely have to, I wondered how else Mom could have heard about this whole Dogman thing. I asked my wife if she had written about any of this on Failbook. She looked at me as if I were insane. The idea of her talking about something as embarrassing as that in front of her friends? If my mother knew nothing about any of this, then maybe she really did see a Dogman. And maybe my son really did too. Since then, I got motion-activated cameras installed. I don't really expect to get any life-changing visuals with the system. I mainly got it because I read one guy online who thinks that cameras will make Dogman and Bigfoot go away. Supposedly, they are both very camera-shy. I would love for the Dogman to go away and stay away. So if the cameras can do that, then they will be worth twice their price, no matter if this was a real Dogman or a delusion. Worm's Eye View of Dogman. Dear Scary Stories NYC. I love all the horror and scary channels on YouTube. As a kid where I grew up, we only had scary stuff Friday nights and sometimes Saturday nights, but not always. Now we can scare ourselves with YouTube any time of the day or night. We're spoiled, I guess, but I'm not complaining. Still, there was a special quality to a Friday night when I was a kid, when my brother and I had the basement of the house to ourselves to stay up as late as we wanted, watching scary old movies on television. Of course, even though we had the run of the basement, as I mentioned, once that Friday night monster flick came on, neither of us were brave enough to get out of our beds. We were suddenly convinced that monsters were probably lurking everywhere, that hands were going to reach out from under our beds and grab our ankles, that the shadow in the corner really was a monster crouched down, ready to ambush you if you tried to walk past it. And I suppose all of this was made far worse because of the one Friday night when our imaginary scare fest was interrupted by a real-life Dogman. I remember one of our rituals back then was to check our remote control to see if it was in good working order before the show began that night. It started as a joke that our mom said we worshipped the remote control, but on Friday nights, it became something closer to literally true. Our bedroom had our beds set up so that they could watch TV, but the TV itself was on a shelf about another 5 or 8 feet beyond our beds. The idea of walking that distance past the hand monster under our beds just to mute the TV commercials was too terrifying to consider. One week, my brother asked me what would happen if the remote control's batteries ran out in the middle of the movie. I thought about it, then walked to the hardware store and bought 4 more batteries. I gave him 2 to hold in his bedroom drawer, and I would store the other 2 in mine. Another important ritual was to relieve ourselves as close to the beginning of the show as possible. No bathroom breaks meant not having to risk there being monsters all over the basement. Still, all our experimenting with the perfect last time to have a lemonade on Friday nights never proved to be an exact science, and almost every time, one or the other of us would need a break before the movie was over. One time, our friend Roger stayed over to watch the movie with us. He was surprised at how chicken we got once the lights were turned off, and he made fun of us all night, but I didn't see him wanting to risk it past the monsters. A couple of weeks later, he stayed over again. When it was getting to be time for the movie, Roger went upstairs for a few minutes. I forget what he said the reason was. Later that night, I was the one who had to relieve myself during a commercial break. I ran to the bathroom as though the floor were electrically charged, and I turned the light on as I entered the room. Now, the thing about our bathroom window, which looked out on our backyard, was that although it was a level to our eyes inside the room, outside it was right along the level of the ground. So if someone were standing right outside, we would only see their feet. But if they stood along the back fence of our yard, we could see them full body. My dad used to say, we had the worm's eye view. So anyway, I ran into the room as fast as I could, anxious to get my business done and get back to the relative safety of my bed. When out of the corner of my eye, something attracted me to look at the bathroom window. What I saw was a hideous face laying sideways on the ground. I screamed before I really knew what I was looking at. Then, as my eyes focused and I could see it more clearly, it looked exactly as though a werewolf were bent down, laying its head on the ground so it could peek in at me. I was frozen to the spot, just screaming. Soon, Roger and my brother came over. Roger was laughing. He walked past me into the room and strode confidently up to the window. Both my brother and I shouted at him to get away from there. Ignoring us, he opened the window and reached outside. My brother and I screamed in fear and ran away until we heard Roger's laughter, louder than before. Looking back, I saw him holding a werewolf mask in one hand outstretched. He had put a mask outside the window, planning ahead to scare us. My mother, who was awakened by all the shouting, never allowed me to invite Roger over ever again. I know what you're thinking. Enough with this Scooby-Doo stuff. Did you ever see anything real out there? Well, I think we did, but I'm not sure. You tell me. This was about a year after the last time Roger had come over, and we had no guests that night. My brother had to use the restroom, and I heard him quietly calling me over. I tiptoed to the room, and he had the light out. He motioned to the window and asked me what I saw. I looked out, and I'll tell you exactly what I saw. It was either a werewolf or else a tall guy in a really nice werewolf costume. This was back in the day long before cosplay, and I had never seen a costume as realistic as this one was. If the guy was wearing a mask, it was incredibly realistic looking. It appeared to be panting like a dog, and its tongue hung out well below its chin. It stood like a man, but the back legs were bent in a way I've never seen a man's legs bend. Its shoulders and chest seemed broad like a muscular human, but its waist was extra thin like a greyhound kind of a dog. If that was a costume, the guy must have been wearing an incredibly tight girdle underneath. We both stood there, whispering back and forth. If it was a werewolf, why was it just standing there by our back fence? If it was a big kid in a costume, how could they fit into that costume? How did they get the mouth and ears to move the natural way they moved? How could its tail wag like it had a mind of its own? We resolved to get my brother's Instamatic camera and try to get a photo of it. Sneaking back, my brother went all the way up near the window to get his shot. He hit the camera button. The flash went off. The camera made its camera sound. And then, my brother screamed and ran out of the room, almost knocking me down in the process. I asked him what happened. He said when he took the shot, the Dogman turned and stared directly at him. We were excited that we might have a shot of a werewolf looking straight into our camera, so we pulled the thing out and waited as it developed in front of our eyes. Except, it didn't. The picture came out all white. My brother took a flash photo in front of a glass window, and all he got was a picture of the flash itself. So we never saw that monster again, and if it was fake, we never found out who did it. Nobody ever admitted to trying to trick us. Nobody acted weird in the neighborhood or when we went back to school. Roger seemed normal, so I don't think it was him. He was too short anyway. That Dogman had to be taller than my father, who was 6 feet tall back then. So that's my story of the one time we watched a Friday night fright flick, and the monster we imagined was actually not imaginary at all. Tonight we've got an especially scary story from Waukesha, Wisconsin, that's appropriately called The Werewolf of Woodfield Park in Waukesha, Wisconsin. Dear Scary Stories NYC. My family lived in Wisconsin for 2.5 years back in the early 1990s. My dad worked in Milwaukee, and we had a home in a town to the west of there. One Saturday, my brother and I went to Woodfield Park in Waukesha, and on that day, we both saw what we at the time referred to as a werewolf. I'll tell you the story starting at the beginning. Now, Woodfield Park is pretty large and it's full of a lot of trees, but it's located in the middle of the suburbs. I don't think it's large enough for any kind of predator to live in, and I'm not sure how one could even get there except by walking down streets in front of private homes or else cutting through people's backyards. It is by no means a forest, although I guess you could call it a mini forest. It's located near the Fox River and the Fox River Sanctuary, which is just on the other side of West St. Paul Avenue. But it's also located right next to the big giant General Electric plant there too, so it's not exactly a rural area. In fact, the Fox River Sanctuary is even smaller than Woodfield Park. If you see animals there, you're most likely going to see small ones like birds. That makes the story I'm about to tell you extra weird, even to me and my brother. So anyway, there are a couple of small lakes there, ponds really, and we wanted to hang out by the water and skip rocks and just chill for a while on a hot day. It was something to do until that night when our dad promised to bring home a horror movie from the video store. Turns out we lived through our own horror movie in real life that afternoon. My brother and I followed a path into the wooded area and proceeded to get lost, but we really didn't care. We knew the place wasn't large, and we knew that there would be other people there since it was the weekend, so we knew we'd get out eventually. We walked for what seemed like a really long time until we found one of the lakes. Don't ask me which one, because we both got turned around pretty badly in there. My brother and I used to go to different schools at that point, and so when we were together, we each had plenty to tell the other about. We liked to fill each other in on all the details, you might say. We would also tell each other about stuff our friends were into, comic books we had read that the other one hadn't yet, stuff like that. So it didn't matter too much to us where we went. We were always in our own little world anyway. That day was no exception, and evening came sooner than we had expected, so we knew we had better start heading home. I could see a street from where we were, but neither of us were sure what street that was. This was the day before cell phones and GPS, so just finding a street wasn't necessarily going to be a good thing if we had no context for where this street went. We both decided to go back through the wooded area and try to find our way back home that way. I'm looking at a map of the park right now, and I could see that we probably took the long way around, but it was our first time to that neighborhood, and like I said, we didn't exactly have cell phones or maps in our pockets. So it didn't take long for us to make a few wrong turns and get lost again in the woods. We were joking around and still having a great day when all of a sudden we came out of the forest and realized we were back at the same lake we had just come from, only now it was dark out. Again, we considered walking over to that street we could see on the other side of the pond, but once again, we decided against it and figured we should just focus more, make certain we didn't make any stupid wrong turns again like we had done the last time. Back into the trees we went, and after a while of trudging, we realized we still had no idea at all if we were going in the right or wrong direction. We hadn't seen anyone since it got dark out, and things were starting to be a bit less fun than they had been before. I was also beginning to get stressed out that we would be in trouble with our parents whenever it was we got home. We thought we heard someone else walking around, and we really felt we needed some help, so we called out to whoever was out there. Nobody answered. I went to call again, but my brother shut me up, saying that if it was anyone we wanted to talk to, they would have called back to us already. I didn't understand what that meant, and he told me it must be some kind of creep or bad guy, and we just let him know where we were, so it would be a good idea to move on and hope he did too, whoever he was. Now I was beginning to get really frightened. The park had seemed so friendly in the sunlight, but now the crickets sounded like they had their volume turned up too high, and it was hard to see where we were going. On top of that, it hadn't cooled off at all since the sun went down. Maybe all our running around and my nervousness made it seem hotter, but man, I was sweating and uncomfortable. Plus, now I was worried that we might not even make it out alive if there was a bad guy lurking in the trees along with us. The sound of someone else milling around out there continued every so often. I heard him on the left sometimes, and on the right other times, but always somewhere behind us. I really wanted to call out to whoever it was to stop scaring us, but I wasn't that stupid. I felt like crying. I didn't know if we were about to get out of the park or if we were walking in circles again. This was not any fun any longer. Neither of us made any more sound than was absolutely necessary, and my heart was beating so fast I thought it was going to vibrate out of my chest. My brother stopped walking and was looking into the trees, squinting at something. I went over to see what he was looking at. I could make out something moving, but I wasn't quite able to see what it was. Then, peeking out through some leaves, looking right back at us, I saw the head of a big, dark dog. I started laughing. A dog? We were scared of a dog? It was a great sense of relief, and I couldn't stop giggling. My brother told me to shut up. I asked why. It was just a dog. "Here, Fido, Rover Spot," I called out, unable to stop laughing. My brother got angry and shook me, shouting at me to be quiet. Then, unexpectedly, we heard a howling from inside the trees. I felt all the blood drain right out of me, and it got cold really quickly on that very warm night. I thought I heard a growling sound. So I was listening more closely. That's when I noticed that the crickets had completely shut up. What could make crickets stop chirping? Another deep-throated howl emanated from the direction of that dog head, and my brother took off running. I ran after him before I lost him. The only thing that could make all this worse would be if my brother ran off and left me alone there. We found a dirt path that looked just like the one we walked in on, and my spirits lifted significantly. We might be about to get out of there. Then we could see the end of the road, and in fact, it was where we had come in because we could see past the trees at the end, and we saw where we were. We both broke into a run, excited to finally be getting out of those woods. Then, something happened that to this day remains the scariest thing that ever happened to me. An incredibly large figure of a man walked out onto the dirt road and stood there, staring back at us. It tilted its head, and we could see this was the big dog from the woods, but it was standing like a man. And I mean a broad man, like a weightlifter kind of a guy. If you can imagine how upsetting it would be to see your path blocked by a big muscle man, now triple that feeling because that man is covered in hair or fur and has a dog head and glowing yellow eyes. It looked at us curiously for a few seconds, and then the growling recommenced. My brother took a right and ran into the trees. I saw his plan: get to the street by going around the Dogman. The problem with this plan, I could see right off the bat, was that paths are made for humans. Dark forests, on the other hand, are for impossible, mythical monsters like werewolves. In other words, we were going onto his turf now, and we might be walking into a trap. Still, what else was there to do? So I ran after my brother. I heard that monster on the path howl, and I shivered all over. Have you ever shivered while you were sweating? Well, that's what I did. Then I heard another howl from an entirely different direction behind us. I practically climbed over my brother, trying to get past him in the woods there, and I banged myself pretty badly against a branch that I didn't see until the last second. It didn't slow me down though. I just kept going, basically by sheer willpower at that point. We made it to the street, not too far from where we had originally come into the park, and we ran. We were basically in this guy's driveway in front of his house, but we had to go past a long, dark stretch of tall hedges before we would be back in the suburban part of town. We had no choice but to run into the darkness, and so we did. Once past, I turned to look and see if we were being followed. I didn't see anything behind us. I could hear something running around on our left, and I was worried that the Dogman were cutting through people's backyards and getting ready to leap out at us from the side. We ran directly down the center of the street, unafraid of getting run over. Honestly, any traffic at all would have been very welcome, since we were the only people who seemed to be out at all. We ran past a yard, and I saw a dog running toward us out of the corner of my eye. It let out a bark, and I screamed at the top of my lungs like a 3-year-old. I really thought I was going to die. But it was just a dog in someone's yard. A normal-sized, walk-on-all-4 paws kind of a dog, not a Dogman. A neighbor lady ran out on her porch and shouted at us to stop causing a riot, and we apologized to her, and then went back to running. We stayed in the middle of the street until we were back in our own neighborhood and the car traffic dictated that we return to walking on the sidewalk like normal people. When we got home, we expected to get shouted at, but it turned out my father was delayed getting back and arrived at the same time we did. My mother had been oblivious to our lateness because she had friends over for bridge. When the 3 of us walked in, she apologized for her own lateness instead of criticizing us for ours. Home free. After we ate some reheated leftovers, Dad pulled out the movie he had brought home. Guess what it was? Stephen King's Silver Bullet. That's right, the werewolf movie. I suddenly felt really tired and decided to head to bed. My brother stayed up for a while but found the movie too creepy to watch, and he joined me in our room. We were both kind of exhausted after that day, thanks to the werewolf of Waukesha, Wisconsin. Hope you enjoyed that. We'll be back tomorrow night with another all-new Dogman episode. Same dog time, same dog channel. Thanks, Biggie. And thanks to all of you for watching this far. If you liked it, please click like. If you'd like to see more of our work, please subscribe. And also click that bell icon if you'd like to be notified when we put out a new episode. To become an executive producer, you can donate to us through the thanks button under each of our videos or through our paypal.me/PeterBernard209 page. To receive cool perks like secret uncensored Dogman episodes far too wild to ever run on this channel, you can become a YouTube channel member by clicking the join button, or join our PayPal subscribers club at peterbernard.com. Joining either at the $3 a month level or above gets you access to our over 25 hours of secret uncensored Dogman stories available nowhere else. Do you have a scary story about Dogman or some other kind of high strangeness that happened to you? Let us know by emailing us at scarystoriesnyc@gmail.com or by leaving us a voicemail message at 804-LA-SCARY. You may need to call back on that one. It cuts off after, I think, 3 minutes. And if you don't want to do any of that stuff, thank you for simply watching to the end. Good night, and have a scary tomorrow.
Come back for more scary stories.